Nú, áður en við hefjum leikinn þá langaði mig til þess að, og við biðjum að koma því að varðandi síðustu spurninguna eða framræsingu á landi og skógrækt, að þá kom fram á mjög góðri málstofu sem við vorum með í síðustu viku með sérfræðingum þessu svið, meðal annars frá landbúnaðarháskólanum, skógrækt ríkisins og kolvið, að auðvitað eru margir möguleikar til mótvægisaðgerða til þess að binda gróðurhúsalofttegundir. Skógrækt mjög góð leið til þess. Landgræðsla á röskuðum vistkerfum líka virkilega raunhæf leið, en það kom fram í tali sérfræðinga frá Landbúnaðarháskólanum að votlendi líka mjög stór áskorun. Þar kom fram meðal annars að af öllum þeim skurðum sem að grafnir hafa verið undanfarna áratugi, að þá eru eingöngu 15% af þeim skurðum fyrir ræktað land. Þannig að það hægt að endurheimta votarlendi töluvert mikið án þess að vera að ganga á möguleika bænda eða annarra til þess að rækta land. Nú, þetta auðvitað ekki einfalt mál heldur vegna þess að mest af þessu land auðvitað í einkaeigu og það verður ekki gert með einhverju stjórnarsaðgerð heldur í einhverju sátt við landeigendur. Nú, en þetta var aðeins það, við skulum snúa okkur að öðru, and now, ladies and gentlemen, we will turn this conference into English. We have two distinguished guests that will be giving presentations right now. The first is Asbjørn Torvanger. Asbjørn is a senior researcher at the Center for International Climate and Environmental Research, Ósló, CICERO. CICERO is an independent research foundation associated with the University of Oslo. Mr. Torvanger has a PhD in economics. He has researched a number of economic and policy issues related to man-made climate change, emission trading, climate policy agreements, carbon capture and storage, negative emission technologies, and climate finance. He's a part of CICERO's climate finance team, where CICERO has become the leader of independent review of frameworks for issuing green bonds, with emphasis on support for low carbon and climate change robust future society. It's my pleasure, Mr. Asbjørn Torvanger, to give you the floor.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and the pleasure is also on my side. Thank you for listening to me, and I'll try to supplement what the others have been talking about earlier. So I will focus on the climate challenge and finance. And all this, of course, is part of the green transition. I will try to avoid the repetition of what the earlier speakers have told us. However, since I only understand like 5 to 10% of Icelandic, there might be some overlap, but I hope you can bear over with me on that. Finally, I will talk a bit about what I see as challenges and opportunities for Iceland. We also heard something about that, but at least let me provide my perspective on that. So I would like first to start with the landscape of the climate change or climate change challenge and policies. How can we handle this? So that's my first slide. We all heard about that this is a real issue. It's a challenge for us. It might impact our societies significantly, and this impact will increase over time. Many ways. I will not go into all those aspects because we heard about that earlier. But basically, there are two parts. Two ways we can handle this. The one is to reduce the problem. We have to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, as you can see on this graphic. And then, of course, as we have heard, it's impossible to avoid all impacts of climate change. There will be some impacts. We don't know how many. There's a lot of uncertainty on that, and how fast they will arise. But anyway, there will be impacts, and we need to handle these. And we can handle these by improving resilience. That is doing investments, doing projects, investments of many types that will make it easier or reduce the negative impacts of climatic change, which could be flooding, it could be hurricanes, it could be temperature increase, etc. Many types. We have heard about that. And also adaptation is a kind of the sister of this, namely something you cannot do afterwards. But resilience you can also do beforehand. As you expect these changes to take place, you can do something to avoid or reduce those problems. And then if you look at what is the kind of finance part of this, as I have illustrated again, in terms of policies to reduce emissions, we all know that the carbon price is essential. You need a sufficient carbon price to send a signal to all companies, households, policymakers, etc., everybody that make decisions that affect emissions of greenhouse gases, that this is something you should do less of. So for that purpose, we need a carbon price, and it needs to be much higher than the carbon price we have today. But since we have a very low, compared to the challenge, a very low carbon price today, you could look at what I'm going to talk about primarily, namely climate finance, as a supplement. Because if we had a sufficient high carbon price, I didn't have to talk much about climate finance. But this is a supplement, as things now stand. But there is also another angle on climate finance, namely, and that is very central in the Paris Agreement, namely the fact that the developed countries need to give a lot of support to developing countries. Because we have the capacity, that is the developed countries, they have the capacity, and there's also, of course, an ethical issue to this, because most of the impacts will be felt by the poor countries. So they need support. They also need support to reduce their emissions, which will also be, of course, a global benefit. Now, we have heard about the Paris Agreement, so I will try to avoid what has been already said about this, but let me comment on some issues. This is, I think, is a nice overview made by AFP, showing some of the central features of the Paris Agreement. On finance, the Paris Agreement states that the $100 billion annually from 2020 from the north to the south is a floor. Much more is needed. We also heard about that. Much more is needed, but that is the floor. In terms of national policies, we heard about the INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions. These vary a lot. We heard about that also earlier, but just to indicate, let me show you this. This map shows actually, if you look at the light blue areas, that these are the national plans where they have absolute targets, meaning that they will reduce their emissions by some percentage compared to some reference year. Whereas if you look at the yellow or maybe brownish areas, these are areas, as you see mostly then in developing countries, where the reduction targets are compared to a reference situation that is expected economic growth, or business as usual, if you like, and in some cases also as an intensity target, where the target is on emissions related to economic output, not only on emissions. So if there is increased economic growth, you are also allowed to emit more given this target. But the main point to be made here is that these targets are voluntary, and they vary hugely in terms of reference years, ambition level, etc., etc. And if I go back here, in terms of the Paris Agreement, I would say this is probably the best agreement one could get, given the situation we are in globally, with sovereign states, all the different interests in terms of the climate issue, cost of reducing emissions, expected cost of impacts, etc. But it's still a platform. It's just, maybe you could say it's a first floor of a building. And you need to build the other floors. You need to put furniture into the house. Because all effects of the Paris Agreement will depend on the nations carrying out these national plans. And even more so, that as you can see on this slide here, there is this stock taking, where you kind of look at where are we compared to the plans every 5 years. And there is also then the ambition to strengthen these plans over time. But remember, all this is voluntary. It's kind of bottom up. These are pledges by the nations. And it remains to be seen then how well the different nations, or to what extent they are really willing and able to carry out these plans and strengthen these plans over time. One of the surprises of the Paris Agreement was that 1.5 degree was established as a target one should try to pursue. We are already, or earlier, there was a lot of talk about the 2 degrees, which goes back to the Copenhagen Agreement, or which was really not an agreement, but just a group of countries back in 2009. But now we got the 1.5 degree. And one of the interesting issues is, well, what would that mean in terms of emission reductions compared to 2 degrees? And this graphic shows or indicates that. First, if you add together all the national plans, the INDCs, as they now stand, we will be committed to a warming between 2.7 and 3.7 degrees. So you are far from 2 degrees even. That depends on the extent that nations are strengthening these INDCs over time. And of course, since the plans mostly is until 2040, 2050, what happens in the second half of this century is also very important for what you can achieve in terms of temperature. But if you look at this graphic here, let me see, there is a pointer here. The blue lines here are the INDCs, where we are and where they would have to be strengthened over time. This is time scale, and these are emissions of greenhouse gases. So we need to see a substantial strengthening over time. The gray line here is kind of path, temperature path, that at least approaches 1.5 degree. So the blue bars shows the emission cuts that needs to take place. And even more interesting for me is that if you really wanted to pursue 1.5, you would have to do these yellow, orange bars. And those are negative emissions. We heard about some types of this earlier, as I picked up, namely forestation. The idea is that it's not enough to reduce emissions. You also have to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it somewhere that you kind of sequester or store it safely over a very long time. And that could be in tree, in biomass. It could also be fixed to certain minerals. You can fix CO2 in certain minerals. You can put more carbon into the earth, the upper part of the earth, or the dirt, if you like, referred to as biochar. You can also do ocean fertilization, where you put, for instance, small particles of iron in the ocean, and there will be a blooming of algae that will eventually sink down and get into the sediments of the ocean floor. So you remove CO2 that way. But as you might, yeah, and one more, there is also this potential of forestry or biomass produced in forest combined with carbon capture and storage. And in carbon capture and storage, you actually store CO2 in geological formations. But as you can imagine, there are many issues related to these technologies. But point is here is that the less you do of emission cuts, if you want to pursue 1.5 and even 2 degrees, the more you would have to do of those technologies. That is the fact of the situation. There's no way you can escape that. So what sectors, if you look at this picture or this graphic, which I think is very illustrative in terms of where we need to go. This is based on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last report a few years back, and showing the sectors where you will have an increase. And if you look now at the blue bars, which is the global picture, and we also heard earlier from Bjørgvin here that, and Bill Gates maybe, that there is a population increase, and you have to increase, and there is a need for economic growth in certain regions of the world, at least. So those are drivers. We are doing more, we are producing energy more efficiently with less emissions, etc. But still, population and economic growth is in the driver's seat because we have a global increase mainly. So that's the reason why there will be an increase of this is electricity generation. You need to do more renewables, not surprisingly. You can do some power plants, fossil plants with carbon capture storage. Without carbon capture storage, fossil is down. You can't do it. I mean, as we talked about, you need to get energy systems close to carbon zero over a few decades. Of course, fossil fuels has to go. I mean, extraction of fossil fuels, especially coal, then oil, and then gas. But whereas energy efficiency is absolutely essential. You need a much more of energy efficiency. And where are we then? If you're really trying to pursue these targets, and we know that we just have a few decades to do this. If you want to pursue 1.5, it's not sufficient to do the second half of this century. You actually would have to go carbon neutral and eventually negative over a couple of decades. That is the challenge. If you do 2 degrees, you have a bit more time. But where are we in terms of price signals? Well, we are very far from this. Remember that climate change is likely the largest market failure globally. Because there is no price on a stable climate originally, or when you look at this. So this market is only generated by political decisions. And all nations then have an incentive to be free-riding on other nations' efforts to reduce emissions, because the benefits of reducing climate change will be spread on or distributed on everybody. Whatever they have done to contribute, they will have the benefits. Whereas the adaptation is something different. Financial markets are simply or mostly short-term, down to quarterly reports. We know that the carbon price is far below what would be needed even to meet the 2-degree target. And even more so, there are negative taxes. There are a lot of fossil fuel subsidies, both on production and consumption of fossil fuels. Many countries, not only as you might think, developing countries. This is also quite extensive in a number of industrialized countries. And not to speak of the expected impacts of climatic change, they are also non-priced, basically. The only signals we can see so far is maybe in insurance markets, because there are, for instance, extreme weather events that causes damages to buildings in terms of flooding, hurricanes, and so on. But that is at a very early stage. So let me move more in the direction of what does this mean for business decision makers generally. Well, this is about climate risk management. If you think that we know exactly what is going to happen, you're wrong, because we don't. Humankind is doing a gamble in terms of the climate system, which has been relatively stable for the last, let's say, 10,000 years after the last glacial, and that has been this has made human civilization, as you know, possible. For instance, agriculture, etc. But now we are messing with the system. We know something about what might happen, but there's a lot of uncertainty. But we need to handle this risk. We are in a situation where there is no way we can avoid that. We know that we need low carbon, we need higher carbon price, but also strict regulations, standards in buildings, transportation, wastewater. Because carbon price, I think, is the main tool, but it will not do all the job. You need something in addition. You need more renewable energy. Here on Iceland, you are fortunate to have a lot of geothermal and hydro. And energy efficiency, improved energy efficiency is a key. Not only energy, but emission efficiency. So to do all this, obviously, you need a lot of knowledge, capacity in business and among policymakers. And you should all ask, how climate robust are our long-term investments? Because if you do an investment of some type that lasts for 10 years, this might not be essential. But if you build infrastructure, a grid, road systems, buildings and so on, energy system that will last for 50 or more years, this is essential. But there are also opportunities for new and green industries. And my view is that a good climate risk management will reduce the risk and increase your expected returns. On climate finance, there is a huge need for this, because we are talking about a decarbonization of energy system and society overall. We are talking about a more climate resilient infrastructure, energy system, and all this takes a lot of investments, not the least in developing countries. It's also likely that public finance will not be sufficient. You will need private finance. You have to involve the private sector. You have to facilitate private investments and involvement in these processes. But we also know that there are a number of barriers that reduces the interest of private capital or investments into this. Because it's a long-term problem or challenge, it's high risk. Maybe in the short term there is a low return. Maybe investments in fossil fuels is better in the short term. Because the price signals are not, so far, as I said, dramatic. So can we trust? What is our confidence in the Paris Agreement and policies getting close to 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees? Because that will take a much, much stronger policies than what we have. So this is also about what do we believe the politicians and the international community can pull off. If you don't believe they can do it, you can invest more or less as you have in terms of the climate or in terms of the carbon price. But you will have to invest more in climate resilience. You also heard a number earlier of how much money is needed. Well, there are different estimates. One estimate from the new climate economy is talking about $6 trillion annually over the next 15 years in infrastructure. So that is 6,000 billion annually. Last year, CICERO and the Climate Policy Initiative made a report for the G7 group, which was then presided by Germany, where we looked at the long-term climate finance prospects. We talked about all of the huge need of climate finance. But we also talked about a number of new opportunities due to much cheaper renewable energy. What is essential is business certainty and a predictable regulatory economic framework, so that private investments and business are willing to engage sufficiently into this. In that regard, I believe that the Paris Agreement is helpful because it gives a strong signal on where we should be heading. The governments have a strong toolkit, actually, in terms of, let's say, engaging the private sector. Finance instruments, grants, concessional loans, different measures where you can reduce the risk for private investments, etc. And we also talked about then some of the potential sources of this climate finance. Of course, you can do carbon taxing, will give you revenues. You can have emission trading system, and you auction allowances. Other ideas we discussed was a levy on international transport, financial transaction tax. And we also talked about more of the innovative instruments like debt for climate swaps and green bonds. I will come back on green bonds, just to give you a touch of that. So on green bonds, I would like to spend a few minutes on that, because this is, as I see it, an innovative financial instrument that could have a large potential. I will also talk about this because CICERO is kind of heavily involved in this. But I take the opportunity to explain to you what this is. Probably you all heard about the bonds, also referred to as plain vanilla bonds, which is actually a loan, where you have a fixed 10-year time, so it's lasting for a certain number of years, and there is a return, usually a fixed return. So basically a loan. But a green bond is a bond with a touch, a slightly different touch, because the idea is that the issuer of the green bond, the agency or the city, business that is taking up the loan, they promise to use this money to support sustainable development. That is low carbon growth and improved climate change resilience. So that's the difference, because if it's an ordinary bond, you only loan money to the company or city or municipality or the issuer. There is no promise on what the money is going to be used for. These are the main sectors shown in this graphic that are financed by green bonds. The typical green bond investments in Nordic countries, which should be more relevant for Iceland, is investments in renewable energy. As you can see, wind, hydropower, biofuel. It's smart grid, energy efficient buildings, where you do better than the standards in terms of energy efficiency. Is very common in terms of these investments. More efficient industry processes, waste recycling, public transportation is also quite common among municipalities and cities, water management, and improved urban water drainage, because cities expect more heavy precipitation, and the drainage systems often do not have sufficient capacity. This was, for instance, the case of Ósló, city of Ósló, that issued a green bond in December last year. Green bonds have been growing fast, but as you can see, they are quite new. Now the accumulated value has passed 100 billion US dollars, but it's still less than 0.1% of the total bond stock globally. Also on this graphic, you can see that it started with the financial institutions, and then there has been a growth for municipalities and cities, but now it's also more into the corporate sector and utilities, power companies, etc. So why are these green bonds attractive? well, I have mentioned 4 reasons here. And the most important one is economic, because I think this is a tool for companies, cities, etc., to prepare for future markets with stricter climate policies and the climate impacts we have been talking about. This can enable easier climate-friendly investments, also by the non-specialist investor. And talking to a number of issuers, they say that, well, these actually green bonds, they attract new investors. That's what one thing we like with these green bonds. So they can, these bonds can also then provide upfront capital for large green infrastructure projects, and there is a guaranteed return, which is beneficial for many. But it can also build public image, and it can be related to corporate social responsibility. There is also the background, as I mentioned, the north-south perspective in terms of the more the global climate perspective. Green bonds have been developed from the bottom up by the first financial actors. So there is no kind of top-down or government management system of this. But the stakeholders have agreed on some green bond principles. These are voluntary, and they relate to use of proceeds, how you should do project evaluation and selection, how you should manage proceeds, and how you should report. Yeah, I dropped that. I talked about this. What CICERO has been doing then in this market is that we were actually involved already from the start in 2007, doing independent reviews of the framework issuers are using for selecting projects and investments that should be eligible for green bond investments. And these independent reviews are referred to as second opinions. And foremost, these second opinions are for the benefit of investors. So they have a better knowledge basis to make their investments on. And they can compare across different, both green bonds and green investments and other investments. And what we emphasize in these assessments are sectors, technologies selected, also governance issues, and that is about willingness or maybe even more capacity of a company, for instance, to do this type of investments. Do they have the skills and the processes and procedures? And it's also about transparency and reporting. What we do is then based on the top-down and qualitative assessment based on the latest climate science. And we have had a major share of the independent global market then since, well, over the last 3 years or so. These are some of the companies that has issued green bonds. In Norway, Kommunalbanken was the first, back in 2013. And I mentioned that Oslo, City of Oslo did one in last year. But in terms of companies, there's been especially a number of companies in Sweden doing this. And one reason is that one of the drivers of the green bonds has been Skandinaviska Enskilda Banken. CICERO also introduced a kind of grading system to facilitate or accessibility of these assessments we do in terms of the frameworks for green bonds. So we talk about the green, dark green, the medium green, and the light green, where the idea is that the dark green is a part of the long-term solution, let's say 2050. If it's medium, it's only on the way to this, and if it's light green, it's only a short-term benefits, but not likely a part of the low-carbon future in 2050. One of the important aspects of this, of using these green bonds, is that it's a tool that builds capacity within cities, within companies, within financial sector, how to handle climate risk. Because when we do this in these assessments, we also have an interactive process with the companies issuing green bonds. There are challenges in terms of green bonds, because a more concise framework is needed. More definition and rules are needed, and also in particular how you can assess performance. How well have these investments, or to what extent have they really achieved what the issuer promised they should achieve in terms of low carbon future and more climate resilient society. And this, I think, for the further growth of the market, this is very important, both for the confidence and for branding. An essential part is transparency in terms of reporting what you are doing and the impacts of what you are doing in terms of green bonds. Finally, let me end up with some of the what I see as challenges and opportunities for Iceland in this regard. Well, I hope I have argued well for the importance of climate risk management. And all decision makers in companies, financial sector, policy makers, everywhere actually, you need to build competence, knowledge in this area. If you should be able to manage this type of climate risk, you need competence. You need to gradually change your investment profile, less carbon, and more climate change resilience. Of particular importance is to avoid what could be referred to as stranded assets. That is investments in fossil fuels. Firstly coal, but also oil and gas, because this will be a high-risk business from now on. You risk losing money if you invest in those areas. And I'm saying that even if I'm from Norway, who is a big exporter of oil and gas, as you know. And especially if you're a long-term investor, you need to pay attention to climate issues. For instance, and also if you are insurance companies, because you have a long-term horizon, and you are likely to meet many of the consequences of as we say in Norway, a wilder, wetter, and warmer climate. Also, pension funds is an important part of this, and they also have a very long-term horizon, and we have also seen that they are also eager to invest in green bonds and green finance. And whatever you do, transparency is essential for your business partners, for the investors, if you issue or invest or take up loans, and generally for the civil society. So my argument is then that also that climate is part of responsible business. It's also about ethics. As you heard earlier today, this is about next generation, that we would like to hand over the world, not in a much worse condition than we are in now, preferably in a better condition. And it's also an issue of the developing countries and people there that will be more impacted and are less capable of handling those impacts than we are. So this is about long-term strategies, long-lived infrastructure. And also, if you limit this to your within company or in-house even, it makes sense to think about carbon and climate tracking and policies. It's about energy use, flights, recycling of materials, and so on. But there are business opportunities. Definitely, there are a lot of opportunities, and not the least for Iceland in terms of, since you have a lot of geothermal energy, hydro, and you could do more renewable energy. It could do a lot of difference, for instance, in the transportation sector on Iceland. You don't necessarily need to have a large petrol share. And also in terms of high climate change resilience, there's a lot to be done. Thank you for your attention.